Hey guys, I wanted to make a video today. Um, just another rambling video, basically trying to cover a few different topics. Um, I think um I want to sort of delve into tyrannical temperaments and philosophies. Uh, Basically trying to delve into psychopathy and why maybe what are some of the philosophies or archetypes of sort of villains and like psychopaths and uh, tyranny in general. Trying to get at what is the psychological uh, forces, basically what is driving things like tyranny and deviancy and behavioral issues in people. And um, I often think a lot of things like that, a lot of things like tyranny and even just behavioral issues and um, just overall morality. I think a lot of things are interconnected, and um, I don't believe that I act in a perfect way, but I believe that I strive to be a better person every day. I strive to improve myself, and um and in doing so, you know, I sort of have an idea of, where I want to go, and where I don't want to go, and um who I want to be and who I don't want to be, uh in terms of like development wise, and just trying to understand the trajectory. And I think um, in a lot of ways, people these days, usually, as far as I can tell, I mean, I haven't really seriously dug into a lot of people regarding this, but I think a lot of people, they don't really have those conceptions of like their trajectory in terms of like who they want to be and who they don't want to be. I think a lot of people have actually sort of foregone that sort of dichotomy, or uh, maybe practice that sort of conscious effort into trying to steer your own development. And and I guess more specifically, I guess that means I think a lot of people sell out. I think a lot of people live lies, and I think a lot of people have sort of foregone any sense of morality or how to properly behave in the world, and I think um, it's really more primordial. I don't understand everything, but at the same time, from I have what I have gathered is that I think it is very much a primordial issue that you can try to assess philosophies and try to understand psychopathy in philosophical movements, but in a way I almost feel like philosophical movements are more so a way of trying to put a word to something that's already there. And um and and, and that in itself is what can spread. So I guess I want to talk about that a bit more. I think things like atrocities and just um I guess the brutalities of the past and things like that, I think is, ever since the dawn of time, humans have been messing up. Humans have been doing things in a very messed up sort of um inhabitable way, or like people do things that are not necessarily I would say rational, or even things that are really motivated for progress or real prospering. And you can kind of get into like the psychology of evil and whether or not evil exists, but I think, you know, the notion that people act in a way that is more or less favorable, I think I actually really believe that. I think people act in ways that are more or less favorable, and I guess one way to tell by that what it means to act in a way that's favorable is how, the way in which you're acting. What is it yielding for you, and are is what the second order effects of your own actions, is that are those are those um are those things that would be considered um favorable, you know. And and so right now, there's, in the past, I want to say 100 years or so, there's been sort of a uh, philosophy movement of postmodernism. And and if I said nihilism, that I think a lot of people would more quickly understand what that means. But postmodernism is sort of a more intellectual movement that, um, as far as I seem to gather, it's an intellectual movement that posits that you can't really understand things, you can't really know things, and you can't really know truth, and you can't know things for certain, and you also can't um, really discern right from wrong, and value judgments and interpretations. There's so many different ways to interpret things that, you know, there's no real right way to interpret things. And so it it's characterized by a heavy amount of skepticism and even disregard for interpretations, and maybe culture, or like uh, say religious morality, things like that, things, cultural values, and institutional, um, I guess, values and principles as well. Basically, postmodernism in a way is very, I want to say, anarchistic form of philosophy that is is basically says, you know, everything is relative. You know, there, who's to say who has the right interpretation or not? You know, it's all sort of, um there's no real concrete, you know. One thing I will say about it is that, um one thing I actually agree with postmodernism is the notion that there is no finite truth. There's no final truth. Like, I believe that because I always think there's more truth. And I think the postmodern claim, it isn't, it depends, you know, who you're talking to, or like what you're reading. But it seems like the postmodern claim is that, you know, if there is truth, you know, it's, you might be able to know a little bit of truth, but you can't really know the truth. And that's a very tricky one, because it's like, um well, I believe people can understand higher truths. um the thing is that I always think there's more truth. So, you know, calling it the truth is I guess a way of trying to say a final truth, I suppose. And but basically, you know, I think of truth in a way as like an operating system. You know, like on your phone, you know how you have to update your phone, and give it an update every so often, and update the operating system to the latest patch or whatever. And um so so the more truth, the more updated your phone, I suppose, is the analogy. You know, the more the more truth, the more that you're gonna be able, the more the more truth the better, I suppose, and I think the issue with postmodernism is that it pretty much disregards with it's a weird contradiction where it says there's no authoritative truth, but it's there's something kind of ironic about that, because obviously it's authoritating that there is no authority or whatever, and it's like that's I think getting at the root more so of what the postmodern um uh characterization, what sort of characterizes postmodernism is like it's a sort of like um it it it's pretty much like authority. It's an authority statement that disregards authority, and so what you see here is a, a sort of almost like an equation where it's like the self as the authority and the other as the non-authority. So it's basically an elevation of the self as the authority, and I think that's actually highly problematic, um, because um, given that there's higher truths, it's to say that there's higher authorities out there, um, and it's more so not as much as being a personal authority or being the authority. It's more so like seeking greater authority in the truth in itself, and I think these days there's ideological commitments that seem to forego that sort of dichotomy, or the and I guess what I mean by that is it's you see people who are so ideologically fixed and committed to say certain ideas that it doesn't matter if there's greater ideas. They are committed to a specific idea or set of ideas, or even like non-ideas, and so it's an exclusionary mode of operation, I suppose, that I think I want to get to be able to really characterize it very well and very simply for people to be able to understand simply. But it's a um I think it's pretty much when people, okay, so getting into the more primordial issue beyond postmodernism is I think in tyranny in tyranny um there's classical ideas about pride, standing in opposition to God, and I it's I think of pride as like that, where it's like standing in opposition to higher truths, and it's sort of um I guess a, a personality of um where truth and meaning, it doesn't necessarily matter, or it's not upheld, it's not seen as any sort of guiding authority or anything like that. Moral values is not, um but rather this sort of the intellect of the individual, the mind of the individual is sort of the main um the main architect and the main authority in the universe. It's really an egocentric sort of universal perspective or orientation. You can think of heliocentrism and how people people who discovered that the Earth is orbiting around the sun. That was such a controversial thing at the time. And what I want to propose here is that we need to overcome the egocentric perspective of the universe. We need to stop thinking that the universe somehow is orbiting around our own ego and our own whimsical demands and our own sort of claims of how things ought to be, and our own obsession with our own intellect and ego, really. And what I mean really is that, like, people fall in love with their own intellect in a way where I think really we ought to be sort of falling in love with the intellect of others and learning new ideas, to where now we have kind of this inversion of that where the known of the individual self is put above everything else. And it really should be the opposite way, where what we know is really, it is in some sense put last, and that what is foremost is that we try to learn more. We try to learn the unknown. We try to know the unknown. And now with postmodernism is that the notion of the unknown is so, it's like you don't even have the unknown as charted. You don't even know that you don't know things. You don't know that you don't know things. And in some sense we all don't know that we don't know things. But as such is really the issue that I want to get at, if that makes sense. The notion that we don't know at all is, I think, that is more so the deeper spiritual issue. And it's important that we can understand things. We can try to know everything. We can try to understand everything. But at the same time, we shouldn't confuse ourselves with I guess the wellspring of all possible information and everything that could be known, and assume that we already intrinsically know everything, and that there's nothing more that needs to be known. Is more so getting at the root of what is the issue, is when that it's deemed that there's nothing further that must be known because it's already all known, is sort of getting into the root of more of the spiritual issues, I think, in society, dealing with willful blindness, willful ignorance, pride, sort of the imperialism that is where you're waging your own ideas against everything else, and where you're at war with everything else, with your own ideology, trying to pit it against everything else. You saw that with Nazism. It was highly intellectual. You saw that with the tyrannies of the past, like the Soviet Union, Mao, China. They were very ideologically driven movements, very obsessed with intellect, very obsessed with orthodoxy, and and it wasn't merely the obsession. It was actually that sort of relationship I was trying to describe, where it's an exclusionary sort of viewpoint, where you already have the Marxist doctrine. You don't need any sort of people to be add on to it. You don't need people to be critiquing it. You don't need outsider perspectives. You just have the main book, the book that you clutch onto, a book written by a man, by the way. And so you're it's the sort of that sort of worship of intellect, where it's really sort of war waging, I think, dichotomy. um you and there's examples within the Soviet Union where there's people who were Marxist, I guess I want to say philosophers, or people who tried to, you know, contemplate Marxism, who were Marxists themselves, who ended up serving time in the gulags because they weren't exactly in the confines of what what uh what was considered, a favorable ideal Marxist by the standards of, the Soviet, by Stalin himself, the whoever was in power. And so there's people high up in power, but that chain of command was so puritanical that, any sort of imperfection was, immediately put underneath the eye of Sauron, this under the microscope, and and it was rejected. It didn't pass the purity test, and so I guess that's what I mean, is that sort of puritanical lens. And um, right now, I think we have a level of individual puritanicism, if that's the right word, where so many people are puritanical in their own viewpoints that, any people who aren't exact mirrors of themselves, it's very much a struggle, and even it's considered, perhaps a danger. And so we see that in the world, where people are, and a lot of the times there isn't very much self-awareness around this. Like you have, it's what's called infighting, where within political parties you're going to have the one-upsmanship of the virtue signalers, who are trying to say that they're the most puritanical, and it's by their own definitions, they pass their own purity test, of course, and so you're gonna have it. It's a very, it's a more and more intolerant, uh, way of dealing with the world and people, and so there's a lack of self-awareness. There's puritanicism within the infighting of political communities, and so on. So it's like they're calling each other out. They will say, they're not a true Marxist. They're not a true communist. And so it's this sort of paranoia of trying to find traitors, and obviously, they could never be the traitor. And then going deeper, kind of what is driving, I want to say, things like postmodernism, and Marxism, and the temperaments of tyrants, is I guess pride, and what I mean by that is the is where the unknown is rejected, and the known of orthodoxy is the only thing that is, it's the only thing that's permitted. And So you have that with, of course, Nazi Germany. You have that with the Soviet Union and Maoism, and 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 I think you're seeing that today in the world. I really do think that there's a resurgence of tyranny, and it's a tyranny of just civilians. I think people are very tyrannically temperamented. Um, that word tyrant is thrown around. People call Trump a tyrant, and I think you'd have to really search hard to really, or be very blurred in your vision to sort of come to that conclusion. And but but I mean that, I think right now we're seeing a resurgence of a tyranny, and I felt like it was one thing that was hibernating. Like I knew it was there, but it seemed to be hibernating. And now it's like it's starting to wake up. And and what happens in tyranny is due to the ideological conformity, is that people end up lying. People end up trying to give false affirmations, trying to give false affirmations to one another, and basically, trying to, kiss feet, trying to make a bed of roses, and to try to gain favorability amongst tyrants, and to so I think a big thing is that, people, they want to avoid. There's something I've thought about, which is, the executioner, in a way, it it can be seen as a survival strategy, to be the executioner, because if you are the executioner, then um then who's going to execute you. You're basically the right hand man of the tyrant, of the king, whoever. So you're basically in a higher position of, the only thing that really trumps that is the leader itself, the leader position. And what it, in the United States, it's it's said that no one is above the law, not even the president. But that's not really how things operate. It's an ideal, but it's not really how it's sort of it's a that ideal is inverted in a tyranny. It's basically, the leader is the person who has the most sort of, um I don't know the word right now, but I think you know what I'm getting at. It's basically, a free pass, to do whatever, and to avoid the punishment of the law. And so, because, you are the law at that point. And so I think that's what's going on right now in the world is I think people see see things as, um a competition for power. Uh they see power competitions. So, competitions of power. So basically it's like, um whoever is able to get into that place of power, they're going to be the ones who are the law, basically. And when by being the law, you avoid, I guess, the executioner, and so, or you avoid just, the law, I guess. So it's, I think it's a way of trying to seek innocence and to seek shelter. In a way, it's almost like a survival strategy. So I think right now a lot of people they're politically opposed to one another, and I definitely think largely on the left right now there's this idea that, you know, if we just compete for power, uh, if we utilize power to try to get into a position of power, you know, a revolution, you know, then the laws will be in their favor, and so that is like a major goal. I think that's what's sort of brewing right now in the political landscape. Um, the ideas of revolution, and um, I think it's a way for trying to seek, I guess, immunity from the law. And so, you know, a criminal's wet dream is to be the police. And I think we have seen that in the past in tyranny, in the Soviet Union and in Nazi Germany. You're having the people who are, the power dynamics are flipped, you know, and so uh, you have the Nazi guards who are using their power against just ordinary people, and so that is seen as sort of the honeypot of favorable position to be in, is simply to be in power, and whether or not you're right or wrong, it doesn't matter as long as you're in power, and and to try to keep that power as well, and um so what that really ties into is Machiavellianism. Um, is so I think Machiavellianism is sort of a great. Machiavellianism is pretty much arguing for um. So let's say you're playing a game, or you're talking about games in general. How do you play games? Do you play games by the rules, or do you not play them by the rules? And Machiavellianism is pretty much making the um, Machiavellianism tries to persuade people into playing games not by the rules, and essentially to instead to cheat wherever possible, to capitalize on breaking rules, um, to capitalize on cheating, lying, any sort of tactics, power, uh, like violence, anything that is immoral, just outside of the code of conduct, and how people are expected to function in the world. Machiavellianism is a way of trying to exploit uh, ways of behavior that are seen as antithetical to the rules, and pretty much it's to win by any means necessary. But Machiavellianism. So I think of like Speed Racer. When I think of Machiavellianism, I think of like Mario Kart. I think of, you know, a sabotagical. I think of a race, and I think of a sabotagical player who's, you know, throwing slicks of oil onto the ground, who's trying to sabotage Speed Racer, you know, or, you know, the main character, or, you know, whoever's in first or ahead, or anyone really, to just try to get ahead. They're blowing up cars. They're, you know, they're crashing people out of the way. They're doing all these tricky things to like that you're not really supposed to do. They're breaking rules, they're taking shortcuts. They're doing everything to try to win, but they're doing everything wrong that you're not supposed to do in order to win. And it's a trope within stories, literature, uh, and you know what usually ends up happening is maybe they get ahead. Maybe they actually win. The first maybe they win the first race. They're actually beating Speed Racer. They're winning the game. But the thing is usually how a story goes is, eventually the tides turn. And I feel that way about tyranny and the use of power. Usually things sort of turn around. And the plot of the villain in the story, since I think dysfunction is a major element of what ends up being the folly of sort of the villain and of the villain of this story, who's sort of a Machiavellian villain. I think dysfunction is usually seen as like a motif, a reoccurring motif, where trying to do everything in a way that is antithetical, I think, leads to disharmony and dysfunction, to the point where it just disaster ensues, and the saboteur, who's cheating their way to victory. Maybe their car breaks down. Uh, their 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 operations are dysfunctional, and their regime of lying and dishonesty, it doesn't really function properly, and so it just leads to disaster, and in a comedic way, depending on the story, if it's a cartoon. And so I think of that, and I think right now there's a great deal of Machiavellianism, and I think postmodernism is largely, I think, a Machiavellian philosophy. I think Marxism is as well. Um, I I believe that just basically these ploys for power by any means necessary is is it might reign temporary victory. I mean, you see tyrannies, they actually do get um they do fester in a way. They grow, they come to power, they may reign for a number of years, decades, and so but I don't, I think they're not forever. They're not forever, and so they usually end in catastrophe because of that same dynamic that I was just describing. um Things are just not functional, and that things just um you know the chain of command starts to fall apart because people are lying to each other, and people are just trying to get theirs. They don't think about following orders at a certain point, and it's like people lose this sort. You're trying to run an operation based off of compelling people with threats and violence, and through intimidation, and eventually I think people that's not how people operate in the world. I think people eventually don't hold up to things like that, and people don't exactly operate. I mean, think of slavery. Slavery lasted for a while, but it started to break down. Um, you had revolts. You had people escaping slavery, people who ran away. You had you lost public reputation. I mean, think about that. Um, Cheating and lying and using power, it it just destroys reputation. Uh, and and the solution at that point is, from the tyrant's point of view, is like, your reputation is just horrible. But what can you do about it? Do you just wage war on the people who don't look at you favorably? And so, it's do you try to bend their hand? Do you try to coerce them into lying um and all of that? Um and so um you just you just see these regimes, they fall apart. You see slavery, it breaks down, and it just doesn't end well. It's not a very longevity. Uh, it's not a very. It's not a strategy for longevity. It's a short-term gain strategy, and you can see power. Uh, it may get some sort of momentary thing, but long term, it loses in the long term. You can try to bully your way through life. You can try to intimidate people, try to create a presence, and make people try to make people fear you, and um, just cause havoc in the world, try to sabotage people, and all of this, and your reputation diminishes, and it lowers itself further and further, and then it's like people aren't going to be helping. People aren't going to be following orders eventually. People aren't going to be your slave, you know. And so, yeah, that's right now, I think it's an ironic thing about Marxism and things like that is because it's pretty much trying to say, okay, that's the revolution is the revolution of the poor and the oppressed, basically like the slave class. It tries to frame it like that, um, and that you need to revolt against your masters, and it's like there's something to that actually, but the thing is that um, I think it's sort of a way in which you go about it, um and overall it's like, is it like I said, is it a Machiavellian sort of um cheater? Is it a way of lying and manipulation, and or is it doing things the right way, and and really, it's operating through authenticity and truth, and I think genuinely, you can't really be a slave in truth. If you're completely authentic and tell the truth, and you're not willing to be compelled, if you can resist um, coercion and people trying to force you into doing things you don't really want to do, if you have any voice, um, if you have any say in the matter, and to avoid the lie, um, that is crucial, I think, in terms of like revolution, I think, because um it's one thing to comply, and it's another to not comply, and it depends on how how all of that is done, and um, if it's through authenticity and truth, I think that's going to be I think that it's really the best at hand way of going about things, and beyond that, um, trying to do things on your own accord to plot and to seek revenge, and as you can see, to sort of go down that um, degenerating ethos of pride and Machiavellianism and all of that. Um, and so there's different strategies. And I think Marxism is, I think it's largely a uh, misanthropic worldview and strategy and mission. Um, because you know to really overcome, I think, something like slavery. I mean, just hypothetically, like, you'd want to not be. You'd have um to completely cure something like slavery, and I think slavery was largely dealt with, especially in America. I mean, it kind of has a new form now, I think, with illegal immigrants and stuff like that. But it's better. It's not. It can still be a lot better though. You know, uh, but um, so yeah, it. I think I'll just try to leave it at that for now. But like I said, I do think there is sort of an uprising of a tyranny and tyrannical temperaments, and I think it's a sort of it's a deeper issue that it has almost pretty much archaic. um, I think deviancy has just been a thing from the start of human history. People deviate and they end up in great confusion, and people wander off the path, and people lie and cheat and just create confusion for themselves and everyone else, and it creates ill discernment. And so um and right now we live in a we right now, with the rise of postmodernism, or basically the postmodern postmodern ideas. People don't realize it, but they're basically scaffolding for a lot of the the ideologies people stand on, I guess. Um, relativism, um, um, and so yeah, so people elevate themselves as basically being the most right, and so it's I think it's an issue in society right now where there's authoritarianism. Um, you could try to split things up between left and right. You have the far right, the Nazis, and then the far left, which is presented as a solution. But really, if the far left and the far right, it's basically you have like the 100 million that died in the 20th century, and then on the right, the camera might be flipped, but on the right you have the Nazis, and then you have like Japan and uh, fascism, and so it's like both extremes lead to both extremes are actually authoritarian, and then you could. So I don't think there's that's one sort of dynamic you can look at things. You can also look at things um, from libertarian to authoritarian, and so I believe that far left and far right are both on the authoritarian far end of the spectrum, and I don't even know if like pure libertarianism is, I don't even want to set roots in anything. So, or yeah, I don't want to stay staked down in just a political thing. I think many things aren't just one dimensional, and um, just simply having a camp, campism or tribalism. I just don't really think that's viable. I think every group you're gonna find a bad apple, and so yeah, you don't want to confuse yourself with the group for that reason, because you don't want to pay for the sins of someone in your that's not you. That's just part of some group that you may not even know, and so yeah. Um, I think I'll just leave the video at this though. I I think about things. I think about a lot of this stuff a lot, honestly. Especially as of lately, and so I don't know. I try to come to these videos with things to say, and I hope you guys found at least either some clarity, maybe some insight, um, just perspective, and I hope I can do these videos more often. I would like to get more I guess engagement on the videos. I like it when you guys comment on my stuff. Um, even if someone says something deranged, whatever. You know, we've all seen that sort of stuff, anyways. So, um, whatever. Um, I appreciate the engagement and feedback even. I know some guy recently reacted to one of my videos on his stream. He let me know in the last video. Um, I might try to work with other people and maybe do some sort of live discussion with someone else, maybe a live stream or something. I would like to get to doing live streams so that I can have sort of a live audience going, that I can engage with, because um, doing just videos on the whim, like without a prepared lecture or anything like that, I mean, I don't know, we'll see. Just trying to run my own podcast, basically just talking. I feel like I have to really have things to say in order to do that. I don't want to just repeat myself, and I don't feel like I am. You know, um, but I don't want to get to that point. So, um, uh, thank you guys for watching. Um, I hope you enjoyed the video. Until next time, peace.